The port is on fire. Not one building, not one facility. The entire northern industrial coastline of Israel is burning, and the flames started before most people in that city even woke up this morning. Iranian missiles did not arrive one at a time. They came in packages, coordinated, simultaneous, layered, and while those strikes were still in the air, rockets were already hitting an American airbase near Baghdad at the exact same moment. That is not a coincidence. That is a plan being executed. And the most dangerous part of what is happening right now is not the fires you can see on your screen. It is the part of this campaign that you cannot see yet, but that the operational data is already telling us is coming. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because the official version of this war and the actual version of this war are now so far apart from each other that someone has to be catastrophically wrong. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly which version is real, why it matters more than almost anything else happening in the world right now, and what the next phase looks like if the current trajectory holds. Let me start with something that almost no coverage of this conflict is saying clearly enough. What you're watching unfold right now across Israel, Iraq, Lebanon, and the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously is not escalation in the traditional sense. Escalation implies that something is getting worse than it was before. What is actually happening is that a campaign architecture that was designed, planned, and pre-positioned years before the first strike of this conflict was ever launched is simply arriving at the phase it was always built to reach. The difference matters enormously, because if this is escalation, then de-escalation is a mirror image of the same process, and you walk it back the same way you walked into it. But if this is execution, if what we are seeing is a pre-built operational sequence reaching its intended stage, then de-escalation requires something completely different. It requires one side or the other to abandon a plan they spent years constructing. And that is a fundamentally harder thing to ask of any government, any military, any strategic institution that has built its entire threat response doctrine around exactly this scenario. The fires in Haifa right now are not the story. They are the evidence of the story. And the story begins not today, not last month, but with a question that military planners on all sides of this conflict have been working with for a very long time. If Iran were ever to find itself in direct military conflict with the United States and Israel simultaneously, how would it fight? Not how would it win, because Iranian strategic doctrine has never been built around the assumption of winning a direct conventional military confrontation with American power. Iranian doctrine has been built around something far more achievable and far more dangerous, making the cost of that confrontation higher than the other side is willing to pay. That is the doctrine. And everything you are watching right now, the missile waves, the proxy activations, the multi-front pressure, the industrial targeting, all of it is that doctrine being executed at scale. So let us go through what is actually happening layer by layer, because each layer reveals something that the official briefings are not telling you. The wave pattern of Iranian missile strikes is where this analysis has to begin, because the pattern is not random and it is not simply about maximizing damage. The early waves of this conflict were not Iran's most powerful strikes. They were Iran's most informative ones. Probing operations, calibrated packages designed not primarily to destroy targets, but to generate data. Response times from Israeli air defense, radar coverage geometry. The specific gaps in layered defense systems where a follow-on strike could find less resistance. Every interception produced information. Every miss, whether the missile missed or the defense missed, produced information. Military planners call this battle damage assessment, but it is really about learning the shape of the defense in real time, under real operational conditions, in a way that no simulation or intelligence estimate can fully replicate. The middle waves introduced something that shattered one of the core mathematical assumptions underneath Israeli and American layered missile defense: cluster warheads. A single incoming missile that fractures into multiple warheads does not require the defense to solve a harder version of the same problem. It requires the defense to solve a fundamentally different problem, because the system was designed, resourced, and positioned around a specific exchange ratio. one interception per incoming warhead. When that ratio breaks, when one launch becomes 6 or 8 or 12 warheads in the terminal phase, the arithmetic of the defense becomes unsustainable in a way that cannot be fixed quickly. You cannot manufacture more interceptors overnight. You cannot reposition systems that are already deployed at maximum coverage. You absorb the hit and you adjust, but the adjustment takes time you do not have in an active campaign. The later waves began targeting something that receives almost no public attention, but is, from a purely military standpoint, among the most significant developments in this entire conflict. The infrastructure that makes the defense function. Radar nodes, communications relays, the support structures for THAAD batteries across the Gulf. This is the part of missile defense that the glossy briefing graphics never show you. The actual system is not just interceptors and launchers. It is an enormous network of sensors, communications, data processing, and logistics that has to function continuously and coherently for the interceptors at the end of the chain to work at all. When you begin degrading that network, you are not just reducing the number of interceptors available, you're reducing the reliability and coherence of the entire system in ways that compound over time. And this is what has been building toward what happened over Haifa this morning. Those strikes are not Iran escalating for the first time. Those strikes are Iran executing the phase of its campaign that all the previous phases were preparing the conditions for. The defense is more exhausted than it was at the beginning. The radar picture is noisier. The communications are under more pressure. The interceptor stockpiles have been drawn down. And into that degraded environment, Iran delivers strikes on a target category it had not previously engaged at this scale. Israel's industrial and commercial port infrastructure, the northern anchor of the Israeli civilian economy. This is the moment to talk about Haifa specifically because the choice of target is not arbitrary, and understanding why it was chosen tells you something critical about where this is going. Haifa is not Tel Aviv. The international media gravitates toward Tel Aviv as the symbolic center of Israeli life, the financial district, the government institutions, the cultural identity of the modern Israeli state. But Haifa is something different and in some ways something more vulnerable. It is Israel's primary commercial port. It handles a substantial portion of everything Israel imports. It houses major petrochemical refining infrastructure that the Israeli industrial economy runs on. It is the point through which an enormous amount of the physical material reality of Israeli daily life passes. And it is now on fire. There is a parallel here that both sides understand. When Israel struck Iran's Mobarakeh steel, it crossed a threshold from targeting what the adversary uses to fight to targeting what the adversary uses to exist economically. That distinction matters enormously in the logic of warfare because military infrastructure, a missile battery, an air base, a radar installation, can be hardened, dispersed, buried, rebuilt with military resources and military priority. Industrial economic infrastructure is built for efficiency, not for surviving sustained military attack. It is above ground. It is concentrated. It is enormously expensive to reconstruct. It is full of things that burn. And once that category of target is normalized on both sides, it does not become unnormalized. The strikes on Haifa's port and petrochemical facilities are the mirror of the strikes on Mobarakeh. Both sides have now crossed that threshold in both directions, and the conflict has become economically more expensive than either government's public accounting of it reflects. Now, the Iraq dimension, because this is where most of the Western coverage of this conflict is making what I think is a serious analytical error. The rocket attack on the American airbase near Baghdad International Airport is being reported as a peripheral event, a side story, a separate conflict that happens to be occurring at the same time. It is not, it is the same campaign. Iran has maintained a network of Shia militia organizations across Iraq for decades. The Islamic resistance in Iraq, Kata'ib, Hezbollah, al-Haq. These are not improvised groups that formed in response to the current conflict. They are standing military forces with established command structures, pre-positioned weapons caches, mapped targets, and decades of operational experience in the specific geography they are operating in right now. When rockets hit an American airbase near Baghdad, there is a strategic architecture behind that event that is easy to miss if you are only looking at the immediate tactical picture. Iran does not need to put Iranian soldiers on Iraqi soil to achieve the strategic effect of attacking American forces in Iraq. The network is already there. The weapons are already positioned. The targets were already mapped before this conflict began. Iran activates the network and achieves three simultaneous strategic outcomes. It puts pressure on American forces. It disrupts American air operations in a theater where those operations are central to the overall campaign. And it does both of those things without exposing Iranian territory to direct retaliation for that specific action, because the action was technically executed by an Iraqi militia group, not by Iranian forces. That is the architecture of what Iranian doctrine calls the axis of resistance, and it is functioning right now exactly the way it was designed to function. Not as a single war with a single front, as a network of simultaneous pressures, each one plausibly attributed to a local actor, collectively producing a strategic environment that is vastly more expensive and more complicated for the United States to manage than any single front conflict would be. An aircraft destroyed on the ground at a base near Baghdad is a message. The content of that message is not about that aircraft. It is about every aircraft at every base across the region, and about the political and military cost of maintaining a forward presence across a theater where every node is potentially reachable at any time through a network that does not require a direct Iranian decision for each individual attack. Lebanon is where the geometry of this conflict changes in a way that I do not think either the American or the Israeli official narrative has fully reckoned with publicly, and where the gap between the brief version of events and the operational reality is perhaps the widest. Israeli retaliatory strikes in southern Lebanon are producing visible results. Buildings coming down, infrastructure being degraded, the kinetic evidence of a military campaign attempting to suppress an adversary that launched 100 rockets at northern Israel in a single coordinated barrage. And those retaliatory strikes are real, and they are causing real damage to Hezbollah's operational infrastructure in its primary area of operation. But here is what the retaliation does not and cannot change. Hezbollah's decision to activate at this scale was not impulsive. It was not a reaction to a single provocation. It was the conclusion of a strategic calculation that the organization's senior leadership arrived at after a very specific analysis of its own survival conditions. And that analysis goes like this. If this conflict ends in Iranian defeat or regime collapse, Hezbollah loses its primary supply chain. It loses the financial infrastructure that keeps it functional. It loses the strategic protection that Iranian regional power provides. The organization's capacity, its operational capability, its political influence, all of it is structurally dependent on Iranian strength. A weakened Iran becomes a weakened Hezbollah. A collapsed Iran becomes an isolated Hezbollah facing an Israeli military with no other active front consuming its attention and resources. That is an existential calculation. And organizations operating under existential logic do not respond to costs the way actors who have comfortable alternatives do. They do not calculate whether continuing to fight is worth it relative to some acceptable alternative outcome, because they have concluded that there is no acceptable alternative outcome that does not include their own strategic elimination. They absorb punishment. They sustain operations through degradation. They look for the long attrition that shifts the equation over time rather than the decisive blow that ends it quickly. Israel can destroy buildings in southern Lebanon. It can degrade weapons storage. It can kill fighters and commanders, but it cannot, through airstrikes alone, change the organizational conclusion that this is already an existential fight, regardless of whether Hezbollah fires another round. The Strait of Hormuz is where all of these simultaneous pressures converge into a single point of maximum danger. And I want to spend some time here because I think this dimension of the conflict is being significantly underweighted in most of the analysis I am seeing. Major naval vessels from the United States and its partners are operating in close proximity to Iranian coastal defense systems, Iranian fast attack boat squadrons, anti-ship missile batteries positioned along the northern shore, drone launch infrastructure. All of it concentrated along the edges of a waterway that is 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and all of it operating under rules of engagement that have been modified and tightened by weeks of escalating conflict, by actual attacks on vessels, by a threat environment that is genuinely and continuously hot. The risk in that environment is not primarily the risk of a decision. It is the risk of a non-decision, a radar signature that looks like an incoming weapon, a fast-moving small vessel that looks like it is on an attack profile, an autonomous weapon system operating at the edge of its engagement parameters with a response window measured in seconds, a commander on either side who looks at an approaching object and has less than 3 minutes to decide whether it is a threat requiring immediate kinetic response. These are not hypotheticals. These are the documented conditions of naval operations in contested straits during active conflicts. And the historical record of major conflicts in the past century is filled with examples of wars that began not because a government decided to start them, but because a decision made under pressure, with incomplete information in the fog of an already escalating situation, produced a consequence that no one had planned for and no one could reverse. The economic consequence of a genuine miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz, a naval exchange, a major vessel sunk, a closure even temporary, is not measured in the military balance of that single event. It is measured in the response of global energy markets to the confirmation that the waterway carrying approximately a fifth of the world's daily oil supply is not just under threat, but genuinely, continuously, physically at war. The price signal from that confirmation travels instantly to every economy on the planet. The supply disruption follows the price signal, and the political consequences of that economic shock ripple back into the domestic calculations of every government that is currently trying to manage its level of involvement in or distance from this conflict. There are two narratives being maintained simultaneously by the governments with the most direct stake in how this conflict is understood, and the gap between them has now reached a point where one of them must be wrong in ways that matter. The official narrative: the operation is proceeding as planned. Strategic targets are being degraded. The pressure campaign is working. The trajectory is toward a resolution on acceptable terms. The operational picture: Iranian missile accuracy and penetration rates are increasing, not decreasing, through the learning cycle I described earlier. The multi-front pressure network is expanding in scope and geographic reach, not contracting. Allied governments in the region and beyond are declining to contribute forces or send vessels. Gulf states that were supposed to be insulated from this conflict are absorbing strikes on their own infrastructure. The International Atomic Energy Agency cannot locate approximately 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and Iran's leadership has publicly declared that the calculus has changed, that future responses will not be calibrated to proportional exchange. These two pictures cannot both be accurate. One of them describes the war that is being briefed in official statements and background conversations with journalists. The other describes the war that is being fought on the ground, in the air, at sea, and in the spaces between those domains where proxy networks operate. The people who know which one is real are not in the briefing rooms. They are in Haifa, sheltering from fires that have been burning since before dawn. They are in the northern Israeli communities where the sirens give less than 90 seconds of warning. They are on the Iraqi base watching an aircraft burn. They are in the Lebanese villages watching buildings come down. They know the window for a negotiated outcome that allows both sides to step back without complete strategic humiliation is real. It exists. Senior diplomats in multiple capitals know it exists, and they are working within it. But it is narrowing. Every additional wave of strikes narrows it. Every additional front that activates narrows it. Every industrial facility that burns, every proxy attack on an American base, every hour of naval confrontation in the Strait narrows it. And there is a point past which it closes, not because anyone decides to close it, but because the accumulation of commitments made, costs paid, and audiences addressed makes stepping back politically impossible for every leadership on every side simultaneously. What comes after that window closes is the question that no briefing room is currently willing to ask out loud. Not because the answer is unknown, because the answer is known, and it is worse than anything the official narratives are currently prepared to say publicly. The honest analysis of the operational picture, the trajectory of the escalation, the activation logic of the organizations now engaged, the vulnerability of the global economic infrastructure running through the Strait of Hormuz, all of it points in a direction that the people managing this conflict understand and are hoping, with diminishing justification, can be reversed before the moment of irreversibility arrives. We are watching that moment approach in real time. And the most important thing any of us who are paying attention can do right now is understand the difference between the war being described and the war being fought. Because the decisions that determine what comes next will be made not in the fog of the conflict itself, but in the political and diplomatic spaces that exist just outside it. And those spaces are only navigable if enough people understand what is actually happening inside it.